Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. Don't talk to strangers. Most of us heard that from our parents as kids. But today we're increasingly estranged from our fellow citizens, our neighbors, and even our families. We're estranged across various dividing lines of class, race, and politics. And we're increasingly consumed by fear of people we've never even met. But what happens when we do talk to strangers? What happens when we do seek to bridge the distance between us and those we don't know? My guest today is the perfect person to answer that question. Joe Keohane is a veteran journalist who's written for Esquire, The New Yorker, and The New Republic, among many other publications. He's also the author of a new book, The Power of Strangers, The Benefits of Connecting in a Suspicious World. And Joe is here to talk about how and why we should talk to strangers and what happens when we do. Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Ciaran. It's great to be here.
Yes, it's great to have you. So before we get into the book itself, which is fantastic, I'd love to hear a little bit about your own inspiration and motivation. Why'd you decide to write this book?
Yeah, so I have to go back a ways. Growing up, I was raised by a funeral director father and a housewife mother, and both of them are really socially adept. They're very social people. They talk to strangers all the time. They make friends, and they still, to this day, they're in their 70s. They still make new friends, which is like a great life goal for anybody, I think. So I got to see firsthand the benefits of interacting with the world in that way and kind of presenting yourself to the world in that way with a certain openness and a certain curiosity. And I did it myself, a little less so than them, because I think there's a big generational difference between their generation and my generation and subsequent generations. But I realized a few years ago that I just stopped doing it. So I used to chat with people, if something was interesting to me. I'm a journalist, so I follow my curiosity, but chat with people in coffee shops or bars or, just these kind of random interactions that I always enjoyed and sometimes went in some really interesting and unexpected directions. I just stopped doing it. So I noticed it one day that I was going into the self-checkout line at the drugstore instead of like going to the cashier. Like the anxiety was building around these interactions, and it was really strange to me. So I started wondering what was happening to me, how I had like defaulted into this really almost asocial mode. And for me personally, it had to do with two factors. Number one, I had a really demanding job and I had a little kid. So I was tired all the time and I didn't have time to hang around like I used to hang around. And number two, just the phone. Having a smartphone meant that I never had to talk to any stranger ever again for my entire life. Like it's so efficient that it removes all the necessity for those interactions, almost all of it. I got to thinking about what I was losing by not talking to strangers and how I could rebuild myself as kind of a more social creature, because again, like I had seen, the benefits of it to my parents. But then I started asking bigger questions. Why don't people talk to strangers? What are the impediments to making those sorts of connections? What are the enemies of those sorts of interactions? And what happens when we do actually seek them out? And that's what really got it started.
So beyond the smartphone, which I agree, it's hard to overstate the consequences of smartphone usage when it comes to how we talk to people in person. Are there any other factors in our culture, our society, our politics that you would attribute this shift where people are more fearful, less distrustful, more anxious?
Yeah, there are so many factors. There is a cocktail of factors. Where to begin? Number one would be stranger danger propaganda, which we are all, and I think you and I are probably roughly the same age, right? We were subjected to relentlessly as kids, that everyone you didn't know in the world represented a grave threat to you. It turns out that that's a really bad thing to tell kids, that they can trust no one in the world except for the people that they know. And there's a little bit of political science research that found that might have actually damaged a whole generation's ability to trust other people. And trust is the thing that helps societies run, obviously, at least Western societies. So there's definitely that. We have been conditioned to have a bias against strangers from a very early age. A lot of research has found that people worry that they're not allowed to do it, that there are social norms against talking to strangers, right? Like we don't talk to people on the subway. We don't talk to people on the corner. In smaller towns, people definitely do. In cities, there are much more strict norms against talking to people in kind of a free-floating way. People worry that they'll be rejected. People worry that they don't know how to do it. People worry that the person they talk to will be annoyed or not like them or not find them interesting. They'll struggle to find something to talk about. They'll struggle with ending the conversation. In the most English thing I ever heard, there was some research done with a group of people who were made to talk to strangers in England. And one of their fears was that they worried that once they started talking, they wouldn't be able to stop talking. They would say too much about themselves. So there are those, those kind of personal hangups. And then there's just a great deal of social anxiety surrounding interactions with people from different groups. I mean, you guys know this all too well, and you've kind of ingeniously engineered a structure that allows people to get past the anxiety. But we might be anxious when we're dealing with people from a different racial group, a different gender, a different political orientation, all these things. We're already anxious about talking to strangers. We're especially anxious when we're talking to people from different groups. And we're especially anxious if our group is in some kind of conflict or competition with that group. And some of that can be a very real, very rooted, very reasonable fear. If you're a member of like a, historically disadvantaged community, but some of it might just be irrational, might be made up. But all these things combine to make the prospect of talking to strangers a really daunting thing for people.
That makes a lot of sense. So you started to investigate why we don't talk to strangers, why we're even less likely to talk to strangers than we used to be, because you also felt within yourself the void that comes from not doing that. What did you find when you started to dive into what happens when you do, both in your own personal life and when you started to look into the research and analyze the larger dynamics in society?
Yeah, it's a relatively new area of inquiry. In the last 15 years or so, a growing number of psychologists have started digging into this and kind of wondering, why don't we do it? What happens when we do? The short answer for benefits is that, research that involved people of different personalities, different genders, in different countries, different cultures, overwhelmingly suggests that when people do make an effort to talk to strangers, and it can be anything from a really meaningful interaction to a passing one with a barista at a coffee shop, that they come away from those interactions feeling happier, feeling more optimistic, maybe a little more trusting, feeling more connected to the places where they live, feeling less lonely, which is very important. Certainly there are political ramifications to the so-called loneliness epidemic. They just feel good. They feel like they're part of the community. And in a time of like great technological and social change, that's a really valuable thing, to feel that you're connected to the place where you live, because it's a dizzying time for everybody. But they also dug into a lot of the things that keep people apart. And what, pretty much unanimously, all these studies have found that people are remarkably pessimistic about the chances of having a positive interaction with a stranger who might, maybe it's a super pale Irish stranger such as myself, who's like the same group, or someone of a different group. We're very pessimistic. We don't think it's going to go well. Overwhelmingly, the research has found that it is much easier than we expect. People are much more open to it than we thought. Rejection, there's very little chance of actual rejection in this research, which is, hundreds of people in half a dozen countries. Very little chance of rejection. They ask people before they go out in these studies to just talk to random strangers how long they think the conversation will go for. In the end, the conversation goes for an average of like 15 minutes. It's remarkable how long. And this can be on the subway. It can be on, they've done it on the subway in Chicago, the subway in London. They ask people what the percentage is of people who are going to be willing to talk to them. And people are like, I don't know, 10. And how long is it going to go on for? They're like 4 seconds before they like tell me to shut up and get off the train. It ends up being like 100% of people are willing to talk to them. And the conversations like go some really interesting places and are actual conversations that last a while. So it's really reassuring to know that this is good for us. And also we're kind of baselessly pessimistic about how well it could go. And that keeps people from seeking out these interactions for sure.
So if I want to take a crack at talking to strangers, I want some advice. Are there do's and don'ts? What do you recommend as sort of a general principle and any sort of practices that you might want to keep in mind when you're starting that conversation with a barista, say?
Yeah, and a barista is a really good example because it's a structured It's a safe environment. There are people around, you know what your roles are. So it's not going to seem weird to them that you're talking to them. It might be a little unusual because we do have a habit of not really treating service people like they're humans in a lot of ways. It's really unfortunate to say, but it's certainly true. You can start a chat with them. And this is a really good place to practice with waiters and waitresses, with people, work at cash registers, as long as you're not getting in the way and you're not being a nuisance, making a nuisance of yourself. The way to do it is to, when they say, how are you? And this is what psychologists call this a script, when you just say, how are you doing? But you don't mean anything and you don't care. And they say, I'm fine, how are you? And they don't care
right.
either. It's just a way of acknowledging without expending any energy on the interaction. When someone asks you that question, answer them honestly and specifically. So I took a class in London on this from a brilliant woman named Georgie Nightingale, who suggests when someone says, how you doing, in that kind of context, give a numerical answer. Let's say I'm a 7 out of 10. And, that'll kind of stop the thing in its tracks, and the people will notice, and they might admire the audacity. They might be kind of tickled by this, but you've modeled the way the conversation is going to go, and they're likely to follow your lead. And when you ask them how they're doing, they're probably going to give a numerical answer too. And I did that a lot. It happened. It worked every time. And then you say, what'll it take to get you to like a 9? If they say I'm like a 6, and they'll tell you a little bit about themselves or a little bit about their day. And this doesn't need to take more than the duration of the transaction you're having. It can be very quick, but it can be really gratifying, and it feels good for you when you're doing it, but it also feels pretty good for the people who work these jobs, who are very accustomed to people not treating them well. Especially now coming out of COVID, there are horror stories of how terrible people have been to people who work in service jobs. So that's a really good way to do it. If you're in a place where there is like a fairly strong social norm against talking to a stranger, so like the subway, like it's everyone's worst fear, the idea of like being put on the subway and made to talk to someone, because the norm is there and the norm is strong, and we worry that we're going to look crazy or people are going to feel threatened, that sort of thing. The best way that Georgie had to overcome that is to acknowledge that you're breaking the norm. So, you notice something about someone, you have to have something to say. You have to make some observation, or, it has to be respectful and curious. It can't be, a creep or loom over people. But when you do it, you start by saying, look, I know we're not supposed to talk to people on the subway, but I just had to ask. And then you could say what you're going to say or ask your question, and then just leave it to them. Mm-hmm. And if they want to respond, then that's great. If they don't want to, that's fine too. Maybe they're not in the mood. You have to respect that as well. But by acknowledging that, you're violating a social norm, it alleviates the wariness that we all feel when someone talks to us, right? We don't know what their motivations are. We don't know if they're selling something. We don't know if they're dangerous. It's a way of showing that you know what you're doing. You are self-possessed. You have a functioning mind. You're not an agent of chaos. And it's remarkably effective. It works really well. And again, I stress, like, you have to do this in a spirit of generosity and openness and respect. You can't be using this stuff to try to sell people things or anything like that. But it works really well. Yeah.
How do gender and sexual dynamics play into this? Because if I'm talking to a barista and I say, what's it going to take to get you from a 7 to a 9? She or he could assume that I'm hitting on her.
Right.
Or, just as a man, start talking to a woman in the subway, she can immediately start to feel uncomfortable. Why is this guy talking to me? How does that play into the interaction?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be complicated, right? And I don't generalize my experience. I can't say that my experience is everyone's experience, because everyone's experience is going to be different doing this. I did talk to a lot of women who talk to strangers regularly, who advocate for it, which is very important to me to get their perspective. So I'm not doing one of those things where I was like, this is a piece of cake, everyone should do it, and blinding myself to racial and sexual dynamics. You don't sneak up behind someone, you don't touch someone, you don't get too close. You have to be really literate when it comes to reading people's responses to things. If someone is shrinking from you, then stop, you've done something wrong. And there's definitely going to be wariness there, and you definitely have to be very aware of how you're coming across, right? Like I became very aware of that just because I talked to everybody when I was doing this book. What am I representing, right? Is there the possibility that a person who looks like me might have been threatening to them at some point? The category that I belong to, is there strife there between my group and their group? All these things. And it makes it really important for me to be, number one, genuinely curious. So you can't just be like, what's up, because then people are going to know that that's something gross is happening here. But to ask a question, if someone's reading a book, being like, I've actually I read about that book. That's really interesting. If you don't mind my asking, how are you enjoying it? That sort of thing. And, keeping a good distance and making eye contact without leering and being respectful and curious. You do over time just get much better at it because you're much more aware of yourself. For women, it's a different experience. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it seems like intuition certainly plays a role in terms of sensing even someone's mood. I mean, I can only speak for myself, if I'm just got back from the gym and I'm feeling good, like I, love to talk to strangers. But if I'm like tired and I haven't had coffee and, I have a cough and my back hurts, I probably don't want someone coming up, maybe being chipper, talking to me. But I think you can sometimes sense that in other people through their body language and when they might be sort of more receptive to that.
Yeah, you definitely get a really good read on that. The more you do it, there's a lot of researchers I spoke to for this and a lot of advocates and a lot of people who just do this in their day-to-day life who are women and white women, Black women. It's what's really interesting that they all seem to agree on is that doing this, while many people would think that you're putting yourself in danger, and certainly the danger is present, right? Like it's a possibility. It's always there. So I respect that. But it tends to go well enough that the people who do it regularly tell me that, and the women who do it regularly, that they feel safer as the result of doing it. So it's sort of paradoxical because, most interactions are going to go okay. And when they do, you're going to feel a little bit reassured about that person, but also maybe the world generally, Danielle Allen is she's a brilliant sociologist at Harvard, currently running for governor of Massachusetts. And she talks to strangers all the time. She's a Black woman, and said that exact thing to me, that this is a way to feel safer. And it's just because you're accumulating positive interactions. If you're not doing this necessarily, maybe all the interactions you're having with strangers is with creeps, like you're walking down the street, and people are saying gross stuff to you. And I fully recognize, and that seems like a nightmare to me. I can't even imagine having to deal with that. But when you do seek out positive interactions, it almost gives you better data. It's almost reassuring to be like, okay, well, that person I don't have to worry about. Like that guy's not going to be a creep. And if you're very uncomfortable, talk to other women, talk to older women, talk to women who are, different racial backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds, whatever makes you feel safe starting out is absolutely fantastic. Doing it in a public place, which is well lit and there are people around, all those things, most of the women I spoke to said they don't do it in bars because your intentions will almost inevitably be misread and people are drinking and it's not a good place to do it. But a lot of the stories, I heard from women who do this, in time, they became more comfortable and it became like a way of life.
So jumping into the book, there's a central character, Georgie. Can you say more about the character and what you found?
Yeah, Georgie is a woman named Georgie Nightingale, and she's a communications expert in London. And I met her through another woman named Gillian Sandstrom, who's arguably the leading psychologist on these sorts of studies. Gillian's great. She's Canadian, but she's at the University of Essex in England. And Gillian told me to get in touch with Georgie, and I got in touch with Georgie, and she told me that she runs these workshops that are like, communications workshops, but she was specifically going to do one on talking to strangers. And I was like, I'm buying a plane ticket, save me a seat, I'll be right over. So I flew out to London and I took this 3-day class with her, which was me and 4 students, 3 women, 1 guy, on the younger side, but not exclusively young. And what they wanted was to learn how to become comfortable talking to strangers. They wanted to be more socially adept. They wanted to understand why this was such a paralyzing thing for them to do, and they want to get good at it. And this one guy, one young man, was raised on a farm and he had just recently moved to the city. And he believed that learning to talk to strangers was like a ticket to travel. Like the world opens to you if you have those sorts of social skills where you can pretty effortlessly, talk to people and mingle with people and things like that, which I think is the case too. So, part of what I wanted while doing this book was I wanted to start from zero for the benefit of people who really do not feel confident in their ability to do this. I wanted to start from a place of like almost like an asocial place, like a person that just has no skills. And I wanted to understand every part of it going forward. So Georgie creates this curriculum where you talk a lot about what keeps you from doing it. You talk a lot about rejection. You talk a lot about fear. You talk a lot about who you are and what you want, what you hope to achieve. And then there are a lot of workshop exercises where we're basically essentially trained to talk to each other. to actually listen instead of like just waiting for them to say something that's interesting to you personally and then bigfooting the conversation for a half an hour. All these things, making eye contact, which feels super weird to me to make eye contact with somebody like in a prolonged way who I'm not interviewing, you know. But Georgie just created this template for building people up who are, you know, feel pretty socially inept and getting them to the place where they are conversant in this sort of thing, that they are fluid and they're confident. And it was amazing. And it was very difficult too. It was very challenging to do.
And did you go out into the field to practice?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I did it in London. I did it, you know, for a good 2 years here. I tried everything. And, you know, like I said, her idea of acknowledging that you're breaking a social norm, that was from Georgie. That's a brilliant idea. The numerical answer to things is a brilliant idea.
I love that.
But just cultivating a certain posture of openness. It gets so much easier when like people can read that you're interested in them, you know, you're not lurid. Your interest is not lurid. Like you're genuinely interested and you're not a threat. You learn to put yourself across that way and they, you know, tend to respond to it. But some of the things she made me do is like everywhere I go in New York, make eye contact with everybody. Like walking down the street, make eye contact. And if they make eye contact, say good morning and like ask yourself, how does it feel? And the answer is like, it felt horrible. It felt very uncomfortable. Doesn't usually happen, you know. But when I did it, I found people were incredibly responsive. And when I said good morning, they said good morning back. And, you know, over time you developed what they call weak tie relationships, which are just people you know on site. And those are really valuable, where they kind of make the world smaller and more manageable when you know that you're going to run into, you know, for me, I never got her name, but, you know, probably a 70-year-old woman who was always running for the bus every single day, like late every single day. And she would just laugh and I would laugh when she ran by every day. Right. But I knew every day I was going to see her and it's really pleasant. We would smile at each other and, you know, it'll never go beyond that most likely, but it was a really nice way of like making the world more manageable. And then Georgie just took us from there. So you start with eye contact and then you get like increasingly avant-garde until you're talking to people on the subway.
Well, of course, it's so relevant to the problem of political polarization, which is tied to decreasing levels of social trust in general. Americans have less and less trust for institutions, less trust for the media, and, of course, less trust in their fellow Americans. And when you're existing in such a politically tribalistic context, your opinion of strangers is not influenced by your actual interactions with strangers, but by a tribal lens of stereotyped affiliations that you receive from watching TV or your social media feed. And obviously at Braver Angels, we seek to disrupt that through exposure at its basic element. But as with Georgie, it's exposure through structure, and the structure is really important. So I know you're familiar with Braver Angels because you attended our convention in 2019, where we brought together hundreds of delegates, liberal and conservative, most of whom had never met before. And I know that you write about it in the book. I'd love to hear, Joe, first, just what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, it was. It really turned my head, to be honest. I am a lifetime journalist. I'm cynical, generally skeptical. I covered politics, so I'm rather cynical about politics for sure. But I was really intrigued by the prospect of spending time with you folks because I wanted to see what sort of structure would need to be created in order to get people who are actively hostile to have a conversation and to have a debate, which Brave Angels, you know, it's conversations and it's debates. And I went into it and it felt, let me think, what's a good word? It felt very idealistic. And I didn't know how realistic it was going to be that, you know, these so-called tribes, which are so roundly at odds with one another and so hostile to one another, whether they could be brought to the table and have an interaction. The big takeaway from it is sort of tied to research that I did on politics and a lot of stuff I read, which is polarization is dehumanization, right? Like at its core, when a country's politics become deeply polarized, it is dehumanization, right? We look at the other side and we don't give them any credit for complexity, for a vibrant inner life, for willpower, for self-control. We really do think that they're mindless cogs in a malignant machine on the other side of the aisle. And part of that is exacerbated by segregation, the fact that Republicans and Democrats don't live with each other anymore, right? There are very few mixed districts, very few mixed towns, mixed states. So there's never contact, there's never exposure to complicate people's perception of the other side. And when you have a really simplistic perception of the other side, you can see no reason to talk to them, right? Why would I talk to a Democrat? Like, I may as well talk to a cockroach. Like, that's the level of organism.
Right.
And when it gets really extreme, it really is kind of like that. I mean, we attribute negative intentions to them, and we think that they're very simple. Unlike us, like the snowflakes on our side, which are special and vital and so complex and wondrous in our complexity, we think very little of the other side. We barely even consider them human in a way. I mean, research has found that we tend to attribute far less humanity to political opponents, especially when it's a time of polarization. So it was really cool to go to Braver Angels and watch how you could get past that. And I think those encounters that you guys set up make the humanity of the other person undeniable. It makes the complexity of the other person undeniable. And it creates the possibility, or it creates in the mind of the people that this is possible, that it's possible to have an interaction. And, you know, your goals seem to be modest, but they're very challenging, which isn't like, we're not going to solve everything with this conversation. We're not going to sit down. I'm not going to convince you to change your mind about abortion or gun control. What we are going to do is we're going to come away with a richer and more accurate perception of that person. And by extension of the other side, to give them a little more credit, to maybe think that, you know, some people you can talk to. And certainly some people are not going to do it, right? They're out of reach. But there's enough that you could potentially form a bond, form a friendship, and then maybe fix a pothole, right? And then after you fix a pothole together, maybe you can work on funding the library. And then after you do that, you can move towards the more contentious stuff. But without that bond, without creating that kind of personal affinity beforehand, you'll get nowhere, because you're just going to be screaming at each other, right? You're not going to be engaging as individuals and as human beings. So over the course of I guess it was like 5 days, I was with you in St. Louis. It was transformational to the people who were there. The vibe of the thing was so radically different at the end than it was the beginning, because at the beginning, everyone felt tentative. It was a little awkward. I think everyone kind of expects to be attacked in a situation like that. But after several days of like super highly structured interactions and highly structured debates, there was excitement about how good the debates were. There was excitement about how meaningful the interactions were. And you saw people emboldened to actually seek out members of the other tribe, which I really loved. Like when we would all be at lunch or something or dinner, people would be walking around looking for people from the other side to talk to, which is revolutionary, right? That's incredible progress to make at a time like this when no one wants to talk to anyone from the other side. So yeah, I really liked it. I mean, scaling it is challenging, and to see how long that effect lasts in the minds of the participants, but certainly as like a form of training to constantly be reminding yourself of the person that you, or the people that you had positive interactions with, to complicate your views of the other side. And then as like a speed bump in the road to dehumanization and dismissal and contempt, just be like, okay, I can, you know, I live in New York. I grew up in Boston. I'm a Northeastern liberal. I could very easily dismiss the entire South had I not had a lot of positive interactions with Southerners, and had I not learned through personal experience that it's more complicated than we give it credit for. But also having the faith to know that in the right circumstances, we can actually talk, we can actually work together. It's just the beginning of a longer rebuilding process, I think.
Two themes are emerging for me here. One is curiosity, and the challenge of how can we make ourselves more curious. And I think that we are in some ways reward-driven creatures. And so if you take that initial leap of curiosity and talk to a stranger and the experience goes well, that sort of creates a reward that then drives future curiosity. I think the flip side of that is it's more challenging to take that leap of faith than it is to get the kind of cheaper, easier dopamine reward that we get, you know, when we retweet a piece of political content that affirms our politics. And I think that's partially because people's identity has become more and more tied to their politics. And so when they are reaffirming their politics, they're reaffirming their very identity. And so people have sort of been conditioned to believe that even reaching out and talking to a stranger, particularly if that stranger is on the opposing political side, is somehow a surrendering of one's own values or one's own identity, which is part of why this problem is so deep. How do you think about those themes when people's identities are just so tied up into politics?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, people they fear contamination in a way. They feel that maybe the other side might be beguiling. They have some dark power. They worry about being seen interacting with the other side, right?
Right.
They worry what their side's gonna say. And the point of curiosity is difficult. It's something that needs to be nurtured. It's something that needs to be practiced. But I think it's a moral obligation in a diverse world. I think you have to practice this like you practice being a good person, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to engage with them respectfully and thoughtfully, and really try to understand how they got to where they got, even if what they believe is fundamentally different from what you believe. Now, if you're dealing with like someone who's in the Klan or something, it's going to be, if you're dealing with someone who's that extreme, it's going to be a lot more challenging, and who knows if they're going to be receptive, and who knows that if it'll be dangerous or not. But for a good chunk of the population, I do think that when you express curiosity towards them, they tend to respond pretty well. And when they do, they reveal part of themselves, they reveal their experience, they complicate your idea of the world. They complicate your perception of yourself. These things are challenging things, but they're like a prerequisite for growth. And I think they're a prerequisite for wisdom, for cultivating wisdom, understanding that people's experiences are different, that their world is not your world, that their experience is not your experience, and vice versa. And when you do it enough, it really is such a relief. I mean, it really feels good to know that you can have these conversations, and you don't have to change your mind, and you don't have to change their mind. You just have to understand that it's possible to talk. That's the start. The part, there's a lot of work that's going to follow that. It'll take 20 years to try to repair the damage that's been done to American politics. But I don't think any of that can happen without curiosity, without expressing curiosity. But it's a choice. It has to be a choice, and you have to be willing to not look like a great member of the team with your side.
Mm-hmm.
And if you derive your identity from like your solidarity with your side, then that's going to be really challenging. But you can see yourself as a pioneer and a patriot in doing it, because you're modeling how this can be done for other people. And I do think if you see it enough, if you see that model enough, and your curiosity is repaid, then you can get more people to do it. For me, like I'm not super left. I'm fairly moderate left. I just kind of felt gross after a while, only getting the same information and only getting the same argument and getting the same thing where we're just like dumping on the other side and we're using the same words to dismiss them. It felt really boring to me, and it felt like I was becoming emotionally, or like sure, emotionally too, but intellectually stunted. I felt like I was understanding the world less by being more interested in scoring partisan points than I was in actually understanding the other side. One of the things I loved about Braver Angels is that the ideal is to explain someone's views back to them in a way that they agree with. That is remarkably difficult to do. You need so much discipline in order to bypass all our instinctive reactions to people we disagree with, to not just be like, racist, like hates America, whatever. Like we're constantly looking for reasons to dismiss one another. To actually listen and listen closely enough that you can articulate their position takes a lot of discipline, but also, a certain humility to not go into the fight, to be like, all right, I'm here to understand. I want to understand what you're saying. And it's challenging to me to to really think about it, to internalize it, to the degree that I can repeat it back to you, even if I don't agree with it. It's really difficult. It's really challenging. And I think it's so much easier to dismiss, and it feels so good. And you get a cheap little dopamine hit off of it and your crowd cheers, but none of that means anything, It's just junk food. We need real food when it comes to social interactions.
Yeah. It's like the superfood mix of courage and humility. It's good for you. I feel like too, that one thing that really prevents people from reaching out is they fear they're going to get taken advantage of. And it feels to me like that fear has grown over the course of my lifetime. People just seem more scared that I'm going to get taken advantage of. Why do you think that fear has grown? What does it have to do with our politics, with capitalism, with the fact that people in my generation sort of came of age during the war in Iraq, 9/11, the financial crisis, the Obama years, the 2016 election? Do you feel like that's a real factor? People feel like that it's like they can't put down their defenses, because if they do, they're going to get attacked.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's something to that. It's definitely the nature of online dialogue, discourse, I guess, because it's not dialogue, that it is everyone's on an attack footing all the time. That's why it's really important to make sure that you're getting more data on other people than what you're getting through Twitter, because Twitter is by nature poor data or incomplete data, right? So when you're forming your perception of the other side, if it's informed entirely by Twitter, you are going to have a remarkably one-sided and overly simplistic view of the other side. So it's very important to try to actually talk to people, to get away from this arena of perpetual combat, which is Twitter, which is a lot of online political sites and things like that, and try to get to other individuals. And luckily there are ways to do it. I mean, Braver Angels, you guys are doing a lot more Zoom things now. So if you don't live in a place that has Democrats or has Republicans, you can get access to them and you can have that interaction. And I think that fosters a little more trust, not so much trust that you're going to be like a sucker, right? But a little bit more faith, a little bit more trust, a little bit of reassurance that it's possible to talk, right? And just getting there is revolutionary at this point in time. It's possible to have this conversation.
And using Zoom also paradoxically makes it a lot easier for people who are less social to participate, right? Because there are folks who might not want to, take 3 hours to come to an in-person workshop where they feel like they have to talk to people, but maybe they will come to a 2-hour debate where they can just put their Zoom on, their video off so people can't see them and kind of still get that experience. It's an interesting thing we found.
It's a great point. I mean, the research shows that in my experience talking to a lot of people, that introverts and extroverts both benefit from these interactions equally. You would think that introverts would just be suffering when they do this, but they really don't. It's just a question of starting it. And it's a question of structure in many ways. So a lot of introverts I met, and I think most of the researchers and most of the activists I met surrounding this identify as introverts. They knew that this was really valuable, but they weren't comfortable initiating. So they wanted to find structures where you could do it, especially to start, right? So Braver Angels is great because you don't have to worry about starting, because all that is built in. You don't have to worry about what you're going to talk about, because that's going to be given to you. Those topics will be given to you, or at least the structure will be given to you. You don't have to worry about the person attacking you, right? Because you're just sitting behind a computer screen. And when it ends, it ends. You don't have to awkwardly be like, so it's nice talking to you, I'm going to turn around now, which people are very anxious about as well. And because you can see each other, you can see each other's eyes, you can see each other's faces, you can hear their voices. That alone humanizes the other in our minds, like those sorts of interactions. Zoom is a little more lo-fi than like an in-person interaction, but people feel much more comfortable about it. And there's a little bit of research, and it's very new, that shows that many of the benefits that we get from talking to people in person, to a slightly lesser degree, but you can see those on online interactions as well. So offering that as Braver Angels is a super effective thing. It's a really important thing to do. And mainly because you can dip in, you can dip out, everything is going to be okay. It's all taken care of. There's a structure. You know who I am. I know who you are. We don't have to worry quite so much about being suspicious of each other. And it just sets a nice template for a positive interaction with people. And then afterwards, you just leave and you don't have to drive hours to get there. And yeah, it's much easier. It's great. It's a great innovation.
Totally. I mean, it seems to me at a basic level, it's almost like, how do you reduce your own ego enough that you can let someone else in? And, there's all this new research about ways humans can reduce their own ego, yoga, meditation, psychedelic drugs, these ways that your own ego sort of shrinks. And then so you're naturally more comfortable. And it'll be interesting to see where the research goes when it comes to these everyday conversations. So to wrap up, I just want to wrap up again the tips, because I think people will be really interested in those. So One you mentioned is acknowledging the fact that you're breaking a norm. Would that be as simple as saying something like, I know we're not usually supposed to talk to strangers, but I just wanted to say that I think your hat is really awesome. And they say, oh, thank you. And then you say, oh, where'd you get it? And then, if they're seem receptive, then all of a sudden you're in a conversation and they might ask you about your clothes. The second one I heard you mention was to give a genuine and specific answer to a question that normally is just perfunctory. So when someone says, how are you doing? You could answer with a number, which is kind of cheeky and tickling, so to speak, or maybe even just give a specific, like I'm good. I saw my grandma this morning. What about you? How are you doing? And then it's sort of we're naturally human, and we'll sort of take those cues and engender those similar responses in people. Are there any other tips that you might give folks?
Yeah, the paradox of it is that the key to talking to strangers has nothing to do with talking. It has to do with noticing something, and it could be something about the person, or it could be something that you're both experiencing. You're at an event, you're at a ball game, you see something in the street. Something like that creates what they call triangulation. Experiencing something together and remarking on it works very well. So being in a museum or something, it's very easy to strike up conversations in a museum because you're both looking at the painting and you can just be like, "What do you think?" And I've had that go in some really interesting directions before. Noticing, and then when they talk, you got to listen to them. And this cuts to humility. It cuts to a willingness to relinquish control of a conversation, which we're all very uncomfortable with, particularly now because we exert total control over conversations we have online. When you're going to respond to a text, what will you say in an email? You can wait as long as you want. You don't have to do it in a live fire situation. So relinquishing that control is very scary to people, and letting the conversation go where the conversation wants to go naturally. And having faith that it's going to go somewhere interesting, right? It's going to surprise you. It's going to go somewhere where you didn't even know you were interested, or you didn't, never expected. It's going to tell you something you didn't know that you didn't know. But all of that comes to listening. When people speak, only ask general questions. Don't ask leading questions. Don't say, how can you be so stupid as to believe that? Say like, so what got you there? Like, tell me about your parents or things like that. And be genuinely interested in people and just let them talk. And don't talk over them, and don't judge them, and don't dismiss them. Be really curious. And at first it kind of feels like you're playing a part when you do that. To me anyways, it felt like I was not interviewing, because it's less aggressive, but like I'm being a person who does this. Right. And I'm very conscious of it. But then in time, it just becomes a way of being in the world, because people really like it, and it feels good for you and it feels good for them. And you make friends. I mean, I made actual friends doing this book with people who were like, I'd never met, total strangers, like off the street. It was pretty cool. So those sorts of things are great. There's one other great tip that I really liked from a guy named Paul Ford, who's a tech CEO, who I know a little bit. And then he's introverted, but he has to go to a lot of parties, a lot of networking events, and he doesn't like them. So what he does is he inverts the boring question, the question everyone dreads getting, which is, what do you do? Especially in New York, especially in cities, but all over the place. And he'll ask people what they do, which most people, when they get that question, they just want to die inside. You just think that this conversation can't go anywhere, right? This is going to be one of those like endless small talk conversations that never gets off that track. But when they tell him, he might ask him a little bit of what that involves. And then when they tell him that, he'll say, geez, that sounds really hard. And every single time they'll be like, you know what, it is hard. And they'll appreciate that like he's recognizing that this isn't easy, that people struggle. And it's like a magic trick. You'll learn everything about people when you convey to them that you're interested in what's difficult to them.
That certainly happens to me just naturally when I tell people my job is to bring liberals and conservatives together. Their reaction is usually, good luck.
Right. I know, it's funny. When I was doing the research, I looked into chimps, because chimps are like, our closest genetic relatives, but also super xenophobic, really hostile to strangers, really suspicious. And I met a doctor who oversees a chimp research facility in Georgia. And I had her explain to me like what has to happen in order to safely introduce chimpanzees to each other. And it was basically braver angels. It was like a super structured, careful, thoughtful, closely observed process that can go on for weeks, that hopefully will result in one chimp not killing the other chimp when they're finally in the same room together. And that's a much more extreme case, but I like that as a metaphor of just like bringing them closer together. Like they can see each other. They can see that they're not a threat. They might be interested. How interested are they? Get them a little closer. Are they still interested? Are they getting mad? Pull them apart, you know? I really like that idea.
Yeah, it seems like it's almost, how do you help people move from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset? And in some ways it requires rewiring our biology a little bit, because I think biologically we're wired to be in, tribes of 40 people, when those people are trusted and you work together, but you're working against the enemy. You don't want to get eaten. There's limited amounts of food. And so I think that biologically, those biological impulses in today's society can manifest in terms of people only wanting to talk to someone who they think can help them get something, or the only stranger I'd talk to is an attractive woman or someone who seems rich and successful. Why would I talk to some, random person? And it's like thinking through, how can we rewire that? How can we get people to understand those benefits when they're intangible, right? They're emotional benefits, but we can notice them. I think it just requires some intention and attention.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Part of it begins with a more accurate understanding of human nature. So, the kind of traditional idea of what tribalism is based on a notion that doesn't actually hold water, like how tribes behave. And tribes were much more cosmopolitan than we know, according to a great deal of anthropological research, ethnographies and things like that. People did interact. They did interact with strangers. They found ways to do it because we're very wary, because the stranger could represent chaos, violence, anything else. But humanity, time and time again, has created structures that allowed us to safely interact with strangers, to reconcile the threat that they pose with the opportunities that they present. That sense of threat, the scarcity mindset that you mentioned, is incredibly powerful, right? So we're not xenophobic by nature. We are when we feel threatened. We're xenophobic when we feel that we're competing for resources. You see a lot in politics, like on a symbolic level, when we feel our identity is being challenged, we act as though we're being physically threatened. And it's really dangerous to society to keep pushing that button over and over and over again. And certainly some people really are threatened. Their livelihoods really are threatened. Their lives may be threatened. So, trying to separate the data from what we perceive to be threat. But it's really reassuring to know that, in the words of Franz de Waal, the primatologist, we're bipolar apes. And there's a better way of putting it too, with a philosopher named Alan Buchanan, who argued that we have a moral dial, right? And the dial can be cranked from xenophobic to xenophilic. And when we feel threatened, xenophobic. When we feel safe, when we feel comfortable, we have a remarkable capacity to interact with strangers and cooperate with strangers and consider strangers like honorary kin. It's practically unseen in the natural world. Certainly in the ape world, we are hyper cooperative. We are remarkably good at living with strangers and talking to strangers and cooperating with strangers, but we don't give ourselves enough credit because we have this kind of mistaken idea of what life was like in deep history. And as far as we know, that's, it was, people are definitely wary. It was a literal scarcity on the veldt, but time and time again, we've been very good at kind of expanding our conception of who we are and creating structures that allow people to safely interact with each other. And you see it over and over and over again. And part of the reason that I really like Braver Angels is because it's creating the next generation of structures that will allow people to expand their conception of who we are and have fruitful interactions with people that, historically we've been at odds with. But I take tremendous hopefulness away from that, more nuanced understanding of what motivates people and what we're capable of.
Yeah, me too. I think that's a very encouraging note to end on. But before we do, is there anything else you want people to take away from this conversation and from your book? Although, of course, they should still read it. Any parting words you want to offer people about the power of strangers?
Mainly that it is, let me think. All right, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of anything I haven't said so far. that it paves the way. No, I already kind of said that. No, not particularly, Ciaran. Sorry for bottoming out there. Just that it's easier than you think, right? It's easier than you think, and you should try it. And if you try it, I think you'll be rewarded.
There you go. And I think if anything else, folks listening, try the number thing. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do that tonight if I order food. And I'll try different numbers, right? I mean, it'd be funny if you're like, man, I'm a 2 out of 10. Like, I just can't catch a break. How are you doing?
It's
versus
great.
Like, I'm a 9 out of 10. It's a sunny day, man. Like, let's go.
I had a really funny one with a hot dog vendor in Central Park where he was like, how you doing? And it was outside the Met. And I was like, honestly, man, I'm struggling. Like my kid kept me up all night last night screaming. And he was like, how old is she? And I was like, she's 3. And he was just like, she a good kid? I was like, yeah, I was like, she's volatile, but charming. And he goes, aren't we all? I just love that line. But yeah, just an unexpectedly killer line from the hot dog guy in Central Park. And for me, that stuff happened all the time. It was really fun and really gratifying and deepening and poignant and wonderful.
Awesome. Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Where can people find your book?
Anywhere, any bookstore. So online, in person, brick and mortar, you can find it all over the place. It's available on audiobook, in hardback, Kindle, whatever you're into. Are you the voice for the audiobook? No one wants to listen to that for 7.5 hours. No, we got an actor, but he's very good. And I've been told by family that he pulled it off.
Very cool. Well, once again, the book is The Power of Strangers, The Benefits of Connecting in a Suspicious World by Joe Keohane. And appreciate all our listeners. Please send us your feedback to this conversation. We take compliments, questions, criticisms, jokes, and let us know if anyone goes out there and has a conversation with a stranger. Send an email to media@braverangels.org. Let us know how it went. I'll pass it along to Joe, and we will see you next time. Thank you.